Okay, welcome back. This is Issues in Biotechnology, the way we work with life. We are talking about evolution, and we just finished a discussion on the mechanisms of evolution, how it happens, and now we're interested in why is it controversial? I will attempt to describe, first of all, the basics of this notion and where its potential controversies come from. So why is evolution still today, in spite of the preponderance of observations which support it as a process for developing biological diversity, is it still a controversial topic? I would maintain that at the outset, this is primarily propagated by a lack of understanding of the molecular basis and the genetic basis that underlie its mechanisms. So hopefully, in the last lecture, I've cleared that up. If you still have misconceptions about that, I suggest that you go back and review that, as well as other literature on that topic. So they have an app for everything these days. This was a picture taken of yours truly from someone's cell phone and then put into an app which shows me transformed into Homo heidelbergensis, the direct ancestor of modern humans excavated from Northern Europe. Not bad. However, you can look at some of the fascinating depictions by Donald Roller Wilson in his more or less fantastic anthropomorphic pictures of chimpanzees and some of his interesting images. But what I suppose I wanted to lay a foundation for in the previous lecture was the amount of genetic variation that exists within populations, as depicted in my rather crude diagram that I drew that morning on the table over coffee. But how do these complex patterns emerge? You look out the window and you see different kinds of trees, and there's butterflies and plants and animals and birds and all this variation, and you can say, oh my gosh, it's so complex. How did this all happen? Certainly this could not be accidental. It's just so complex. But wait, remember I told you before about how seemingly complex patterns can emerge from very simple rules. I showed you some classic examples in a previous lecture, but we remember the complexity, for example, of fractals, where at its outset, these images look astoundingly complex. But really, they're generated from the reiteration of rather simple algorithms. So when you look outside and you see the diversity of life, you stroke your chin and say, oh my goodness, it's so complex. But really, look closer. How do complex patterns emerge? From simple rules. Let me give you an example, however fanciful. Can we write poetry evolution's way? Could a room full of monkeys randomly pecking write a Shakespearean sonnet? Not very likely. Not 100 monkeys over 1 million years randomly pecking are likely to come up with a coherent, let alone beautiful, Shakespearean sonnet. But wait, what if we impose some rules, like evolution does, such as selection? And we can see how nature increases the chances of success. So remember, a Shakespearean sonnet, we need 14 lines and a characteristic rhyme pattern, AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, with a 2-line envoy GG as the rhyming pattern. And if you're Shakespeare, you do that in iambic pentameter. So let's first agree Not a Shakespearean sonnet exactly, but the general pattern, okay? And only those successful results will be maintained. So, given that, let's depict how we might write poetry evolution's way. Artificial evolution by cumulative selection. Let's take a first team of monkeys, for example. They make words. Whenever a monkey accidentally types a sequence of letters that a computer would recognize as a valid word, it'll be saved. Roses is saved. Rosebigs is not saved. Saved words then accumulate in that computer over time. The second team of monkey makes sentences. Words generated by team 1 are entered by team 2 as random sequences. Only sentences with subjects and predicates are saved. Roses are red is saved. Roses salad bleakly is not saved. Actually, it might be in my computer. But anyway, saved sentences then will accumulate over time in computer number 2. The third team of monkeys is making sonnets. Sentences from team 2 are randomly ordered by team 3. Only 14-line sequences conforming to a sonnet form are saved. The fourth team of monkeys are publishing sonnet collections. Sonnets from team 3 are collected by team 4. Most of the sonnets are nonsense. A few are coherent. A tiny fraction are beautiful. So, publish or perish becomes the final selection pressure. The final selection, books are offered to the public. The public then acts as the final selection screen, where only those books that sell out are reprinted. The worst is selected out, the best is kept. Publish or perish. So you see, some sonnets go extinct, others live on. Some have survival value. And such is the unity of life. Such is the conveyance of information. Such as monkeys typing letters, making words, making sentences, making sonnets, making books. We have genetic information making genes, making chromosomes, making cells, making organisms, making populations, making new species, and so on. Yes, it's truly remarkable. But it is an algorithm that is supported by simple emergent rules. So the worldview before 1859 held that organisms were put on Earth by a creator at the same time. That organisms were fixed in a population. There were no additions or subtractions. That the Earth was about 6,000 years old, and that the Earth is mostly unchanged. After 1859, this worldview began to change, not only because of the work of Darwin, but the supporting evidence that's accumulated from geology, anthropology, biology, psychology, and many other fields. But certainly since 1859, we recognize that organisms change over time, that species have gone extinct. New species have occurred. Some organisms, while they have gone extinct, seem through intermediates have given rise to ones that are current. The geologic record and its measurement supports the contention that the Earth is more than 6,000 years old by quite a bit. That the geology of Earth is not constant, but is changing, and so is biology. In fact, we might say that one of the hallmarks of life is that given biology, there will be change. So, given the preponderance of this information and observation, why is evolution controversial? What's the big deal? So what? Why do we see the types of misconceptions as depicted in this billboard? Why do we have people who would adamantly propose that we do not teach evolution or its observations to children in public schools? Or support the idea that life is not an accident, that perhaps that evolution becomes a scary idea if it means that life has no meaning, that people are animals, or perhaps leading to a conclusion that there is no God, that there are no absolutes, that one idea seems to feed into another. What I would suggest is that evolution then is an explanation for biological diversity, and that we need to make a distinction, a careful distinction, between an explanation for biological diversity and belief. And that the tendency to philosophize about the observations that we make into wider circles of belief is perhaps unfounded. Dr. Ken Miller was at this university not too long ago and gave a lecture on evolution. What is it and why is it controversial, which is also posted at this website. And I want to thank Dr. Miller for his presentation and acknowledge his contribution to our understanding about this as a controversy, as well as to the slides and some of the content which I've given in some of these lectures. I humbly acknowledge and thank Dr. Miller for his contribution and hope that these are adequately represented, and I fully support his point of view. Many of you may know Dr. Miller, perhaps not personally, but through his work, not only as a cell biologist. He's currently a professor at Brown University, but he's also one of the authors of the most widely used books on biology used in teaching biology to high school students in the United States and abroad. Published by Prentice Hall over at least these 3 different iterations. Many of you probably have had this textbook in your high school biology courses. Many of you actually, as Dr. Miller points out in his lecture, may curse him because of this, but on the other hand, I think we all are indebted to the fine work that Dr. Miller has devoted to the making and publishing of this book. But Dr. Miller has also been very influential in our thinking about the controversies surrounding evolution and its explanation for biological diversity. Why is this topic so polarized? How is the subject itself resolved? Why does Time magazine come out with a cover depicting the evolution wars? Or National Geographic, was Darwin wrong? Why is it so controversial? Is intelligent design coming to your campus? Well, by focusing on scientific evidence for evolution, I think some of this subject is resolved away from its controversy. By noticing the fundamental facts and observable experiments and reproducible results that contribute to the conclusion of biological diversity and its origins, we can resolve and, I think, dispense with some of this polarizing topic. By stressing the distinction further between science and belief. We could say that facts are facts, as we understand them from repeated observation of nature and from reproducible experiments. Belief is a more personal matter. The Origin of Species in 1859 was a hallmark publication. Brave, ingenious, insightful, and stands as a body of work which has been repeatedly supported by vast volumes of observation and scientific research. As a matter of fact, if you were able to come up with an experimental design which would refute evolution as an idea that supports biological diversity, and it was repeated and reproduced and published in a peer-reviewed journal, you would be famous. I encourage you to do that if you're so moved. I think another reason for this contention is that we can talk about the evolution of flowers. We can talk about the evolution of wildebeests. And we can talk about new speciation as it occurs in salamanders. But what about humans? Somehow, we want to think of ourselves as special. It might be part of a trap of our own consciousness or our own biology itself. Where did humans come from is an ancient, ancient idea, predating that of civilization itself. Where did I come from? Where did you come from? Who were my ancestors? Who are my family? Were ancient humans a single species? Did they separate from a single species? Did the separate species interbreed with each other? Did these different groups, as they become geographically isolated around the planet, interbreed with each other? Was there significant admixture the way there is today, confluently in our society? Well, we look to fossil evidence in the past, and we see that there were primates that existed that were similar to our species, which were older than our species, that no longer exist, which seem to have been progenitor to modern humans, Homo sapiens. This has been constructed through the fine work of anthropologists, but now more substantiated through DNA evidence as well. Not only our own DNA, but the DNA from some of these now extinct species. But we look at the geologic record, and that over time, from Australopithecus up through Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, eventually to Homo sapien more currently. And that we can see that when one species diverge, another species emerges. This has more or less been substantiated not only through the accumulation of denser and denser fossil records, but also through modern genomic sequencing. After all, this is a course on biotechnology. So the ability to recover ancient DNA and sequence it from Neanderthal bones, or more recently, from the finger of a little girl that was fossilized in a cave in Eastern Asia. We see the Denisovans as a separate species which interbred with certain groups of humans and contributed to the genomes of some of modern human populations today, as did Neanderthals. So, through the preponderance of information from fossil record, from anthropology, and now examination of modern DNA sequences, we see that humans are not simply one species that all of a sudden existed, but rather the confluence of many and many different admixtures of populations which were geographically and maybe culturally and linguistically isolated, which contribute to the genetics and the diversity that we see in this room. We see also the commonalities that exist in the now sequenced chimpanzee genome mapped against the sequenced human genome, leaving little doubt of its common origins. The chimpanzee genome, in fact, is a bitter-sweet celebration, first published in 2004. Beyond the genome, we see the threat of extinction of some of our nearest primates. Sadly, our nearest relatives are imprisoned, treated poorly, and hunted for meat. How many gorillas are still left on the planet? We now have the entire mountain gorilla genome and can compare that with Pan-Paniscus, Pan-Troglodyte, and other primates. How many orangutans are still existing in the wild? Scant few, I'm afraid. Our understanding of evolutionary relationships, not only to these primates, but to all other organisms, becomes abundantly apparent when we compare this at the DNA level. Where did humans come from? Not one species, but the admixtures of many. We can see this replete in the fossil record. While some species contributed to the existence of modern humans, others went extinct. Not only true for humans in this pattern, but also for lots of other organisms. Rendering true the depiction that Darwin presented in his phylogenetic tree seems strikingly similar to the phylogenetic tree shown on the left, now proposed for humans. How do we explain the information in DNA out to an organism that can finally discuss it, let alone analyze it in terms of speciation? We look at the origin of the pseudogene that I explained for human beta globin, where human beta globin, yes, your hemoglobin gene again, is represented by 6 alleles. In the human, these have one pseudogene, represented here in the middle in white, which is defective because of various different mutations which occur throughout that gene, rendering it defective. As I explained before, the chimpanzee has exactly those same mutations in exactly that same beta globin pseudogene. What is the explanation, other than inheritance, for matching mutations exactly in that same pseudogene? Where did humans get their 46 chromosomes? We can see that a fusion between chromosome 13 and chromosome 12 in chimpanzees, which have 48 chromosomes, might result in the fused chromosome 2 that we see in humans. Human chromosome 2 shows the exact point at which that fusion took place between centromere 13 and centromere 12 in humans, in chimpanzees. So where did our consciousness come from? What is the biology of ideas? How will genomic technologies illuminate our humanity? Certainly, the acceleration of this technology, such as the 454 system and how it can analyze very small portions of DNA and reconstruct them back into a sequence so that we can stitch together the genome of an ancient Neanderthal and compare it to modern humans has made these types of analyses reality. Recently, the example published by the project known as ENCODE illuminates the function of what was previously called junk DNA. The DNA that exists between genes is involved in a lot of information, which also renders our evolution even more dense and complicated. This giving rise to the science of pharmacogenomics and the possibility of analyzing our genealogy through our DNA. Genomics now is married to anthropology, which anthropology is no longer only the science of analyzing shards of clay and arrowheads and migratory pathways and other artifacts left by humans, but now we can understand this in a forensic manner by looking at comparative genomics. We understand at a high level now the origins of humans out of Africa, no longer supposing an out of Africa hypothesis, but certainly recognizing that African diversity strongly supports African origins, but also the analysis of genomes recognizing an ancient origin out of that diversity which occurred within African populations and the earlier examples of the genus Homo. We're all African American. And that out of that African origin, the rest of diversity as humans migrated and interbred with each other and became geographically isolated to depict some of the traits that we render now xenophobic. Some of these traits can be analyzed genetically. Here is the analysis of an individual network as depicted by the mitochondrial DNA marker HVS1. And we can see color-coded here in this cladogram of different peoples, recognizing blue as occurring in European populations, red from Asia, and green from Africa. What we see is that for this one marker, the African population is in fact clustered, further supporting an out of Africa hypothesis. But this becomes more diverse as we cross out into these other populations. Green still existing in other populations as it extends. But now if we look at other markers, again, these are rather crude, such as microsatellites or restriction site polymorphisms combined. We see that these do now cluster into these populations depicting unique populations of Africans, Europeans, and Asians for just these crude selected markers. So if we go to whole genome-wide sequencing, the denser and denser this resolution becomes. So we get a greater understanding of human diversity by looking at genomics. How much do we differ? All of you are slightly different. Yeah, I'm a biologist, I can recognize that. The number of DNA differences between identical twins would be 0 base pairs. Identical twins should be genetically identical. Not quite always, but close enough to call that 0. Unrelated humans, the number of DNA differences would be 1 in 1,000 base pairs. A human versus a chimp, 1 in 100 base pairs are different. Human versus broccoli, 2 out of 3. Or another way to look at that is you are 1/3 the same as a broccoli plant. Populations and DNA variants. If you were to look at small population numbers, like 150 African populations, 120 Europeans, and 700 Asians, in studies which have been conducted, we show that these genetic systems, more than 200 DNA variants, can be measured in each individual. And these types of studies just at that type of resolution, which is scant in comparison to what can be done now, genetic relationships of world population depict that we can resolve different tribes in Africa based on genetic variation. We can resolve the differences between the castes in India. These often are separated by marriage and isolated as such. But we can also recognize differences in isolated populations in Europe, recognizing markers that are distinct between the Finns, the Poles, the French, and so on, owing to the fact that people often marry people they can speak to. The French marry French, the Poles marry Poles, and therefore a condensation of genetic markers, similar to my allopatric or sympatric speciation. These markers accumulate within those populations, and these can be detected genetically. Studies on human variation, then, for all the money we've spent, indicate that all humans are quite similar to one another at the DNA level. That genetic variation is geographically structured. This is becoming less so as we become more of a global society. The populations that have lived close to one another tend to be more similar genetically. And that this genetic information can inform us about the history of a population and about who we are. Who are you is depicted in your genealogy and your genetics. And this also will relate to later lectures as we describe genetic variation as it relates to healthcare, personalized medicine. It also informs us more about the superficiality of racism. We are all genetically similar. We all have similar genetic origins. What is the origin of race? But the real driving force in the struggle over evolution is the presumption of conflict between science and religion, between observable facts and well-held personal beliefs. This picture given to me by Ken Miller shows the Bible on one side being weighed against none other than Ken Miller's biology textbook on the right. Are these really in conflict? What is the controversy depicting biological diversity by evolution and well-held beliefs? Are these really opposed? We live in interesting times. Kansas has voted to delete evolution from the state science curriculum not once but twice. More recently, there was a similar conflict in the Board of Education in Dover, Pennsylvania, in which Ken Miller was one of the expert witnesses and spoke here immediately after being an expert witness at that trial. And in 1999, the Board of Education in the state of Kansas voted to remove all mention of evolution from the state science curriculum. Why? Why the contention? And in Texas, not too long ago, Texas set standards to question evolution in the fossil record, shown depicted here in this example from the journal Science in 2009, prompting Governor Rick Perry at the time to endorse intelligent design as an alternative to an explanation of biological diversity to explain changes in biology that may happen alongside the theory of evolution. The textbook battle also brewed in Louisiana over evolution. This is not the first time this has occurred. This has a history, in fact, in the United States. In 1925, a young man was actually arrested for teaching evolution in a public school. The Scopes trial was well known and depicted in the play Inherit the Wind, which I would invite you to all see, starring Spencer Tracy and Gene Kelly. In real life, this was depicted and played out as a young man was found guilty of teaching evolution in a public school in Tennessee. More recently, the trial that resulted in Pennsylvania led the judge to rule that intelligent design is not science, therefore should not be taught in a science class, but perhaps as an explanation for religious beliefs, but until reduced to reproducible facts or observations and published as science, should not be taught in a science class. Ken Miller published this book called Only a Theory: Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, which I think does an excellent job of contrasting the science versus belief. Ken Miller is a devout Christian and reconciles his observations of nature with his beliefs, not only in that book, but with a previously published book called Finding Darwin's God. But this is not finished. This controversy is emotionally embroiled, and it matters for our society globally and for our country's future. You can think personally about that yourself and maybe grapple with it, but I would invite you to read Ken Miller's books or go up and talk to him at Brown. I'm sure he would welcome your conversation or your correspondence. Why is then evolution under attack? Why evolution? Why not cell biology? Why not physiology? Is organic chemistry controversial? Why evolution? Well, it polarizes because of perhaps different contentions that seem to align with it somehow. People question the meaning of life, standards, marriage, laws, and creation, all which seem to fall in one pillar, polarized against evolution, lawlessness, homosexuality, pornography, and abortion, as depicted here on the right in this cartoon from a recent newspaper. Darwin's ideas were, and still are, regarded as a dangerous threat to God-centered understanding of mankind's place in the living world. But why evolution? Why is it polarized, creation versus evolution? Does it need to be so? Evolution apparently allows one to draw theological conclusions. Check out this one by David Hull. Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the data of natural history may not be like, he is not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. He is also not a loving God who cares about his productions. He is not even the awful God portrayed in the book of Job. The God of the Galapagos is a careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical God. He is certainly not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray to. It is that kind of incendiary language, I think, which incites a polarizing view of an explanation of evolution, if not a polarizing view between religion as a philosophy and science as a philosophy. I think a lot of the work by Richard Dawkins has a similar compelling effect on people. which, while recognizing the basis and the science behind evolution, tends to be polarizing rather than uniting around observable facts. On the other hand, the pressure from both sides continues. Because of this conflict, some would suppose to have non-scientific explanations included in scientific textbooks that are alternative ideas to what we see about evolution. Now remember, evolution as an explanation is not just simply one idea. The information is high and piled around the room in support of this. And as I've already said, if you can go out and devise an experiment which would clearly undermine all of these observable facts, you're a genius. And you'll be famous if you're correct. But remember, extraordinary results will require extraordinary proof. So, the burden of proof is on you. We already have collected vast amounts of information in support of what we observe out there in nature. Your job is to come up with something that would either explain it another way, in a way that is science and apart from belief, or not enter into the fray of scientific explanation itself. You can believe whatever you want, but that's not science. So in this conflict, we see inclusions that people would want to say, like what was proposed to Ken Miller, that they wanted to put an explanation in his textbook, that this textbook contains material on evolution, that evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. I think Ken Miller responded to this with a definite no, and that if this was included in his textbook, he would withdraw it from publication. Or perhaps that we should also include this, that this textbook contains opinions that the Earth is over 4 billion years old. Because some people strongly believe that the Earth cannot be this old, this material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Or perhaps this one, that this textbook contains material suggesting that the Earth is round, that the shape of the Earth is a controversial topic, and not all scientists accept this theory. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Tongue-in-cheek, I think, but I think you see the point. This textbook contains material on gravity. Gravity is a theory, not a fact, regarding a force that cannot be detected or directly seen. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. If I were to drop this pen, it will fall. The design movement was spearheaded primarily in recent times by the Seattle-based Discovery Institute, and you can go to their website for a definition on intelligent design. What's behind the lure of design? Behind the idea that a clock must have a clockmaker, that it is so complex that there must be some outside force designing it, the way we ourselves impose design on a clock. Or is, as Richard Dawkins proposes, that the watchmaker is blind. That all of this resulted from simple emergent rules by chance and necessity. That given DNA, this diversity will occur. You know, there is the comparison between the evolution of genes and cells and species and populations, and that occurs with ideas and knowledge and books. In fact, it's been recognized that there's a parallel, or at least more than a metaphor, between the evolution of ideas and the mechanisms which drive biological evolution. In fact, think about it. There's a connection between these. As we deepen our imprint of the natural world, we increase our responsibility for it. And therefore, these ideas of understanding evolution are of utmost importance to our society today. We must deepen our sense and understanding of our natural world, of who we are and our relationship to other organisms. A God who makes all things new is certainly not one who would have imprinted a static and flexible order into his living world, nor is he one who would have created only in the simple and direct ways of human nature. That's a quote from Ken Miller's book, I believe, and here you can look from Isaiah, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, or my thoughts higher than your thoughts." So, is Darwin's legacy in league now with modern biology, DNA biology, and modern genomics to show that we are merely prisoners of our own chemistry and physics, the meaningless result of chance and circumstance, the encounters between atoms and molecules in a pointless, purposeless universe? I would propose, so what if that is the case? What if it's not? Who here can answer that? I would also suggest that we are aware of but a sliver of information that surrounds us. I'm reminded of Robert Pirsig's book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's a great story. He and his son riding across the United States on a motorcycle. And early on in the book, he says, out of all of this awareness, we must select. And what we select and call consciousness is only a small part of the awareness. And that the process of selection mutates it. Out of the endless landscape of awareness, we take a handful of sand and call that the world. We are so influenced by what we think we know, but clearly this is just a very small sliver of information which is unknowable. Mysteries on mysteries is a phrase that's repeated in most world religions I've read. We know so little and suppose so much. But on the other hand, the world is round. I think this is true. The assertion that science alone can lead us to truth regarding the purpose of existence, which is, of course, that it does not have one, or the reality that such statements are philosophical in themselves, not scientific in nature, and therefore not testable by the methods of science, is a ruse to that assertion itself. There is no evidence-based knowledge. In fact, they have no more scientific standing than faith-based assertions on the nature of existence. The key question is whether science carries us deeply into the mystery of life and more deeply into the world around us, more deeply to question who we are and our relationship to the world around us and its universe. Evolution just a theory? Hardly. There is a lot of evidence around us that supports the origin of new species, as depicted in what I've explained here today. What is a theory? What is a fact? What is a belief? This leads me to genes and ideas. Ideas evolve like genes. Look at this example of the evolution of headlights. When cars were first developed, headlights were lanterns near the driver's seat. Lanterns then moved to the front of cars. And then eventually we had electrified headlights that eventually became embedded into fenders. And the fenders moved to the front of the car, and headlights embedded became integral into the fenders themselves and the modern lights that we have. Until now, we see that we might have a Googleable car that self-drives. This is the evolution of ideas. This is the evolution of innovation. This is the evolution of humanity. Genes and ideas. No organ in the history of evolution has ever grown as fast as the human brain. What is the origin of consciousness if not neurobiology? I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am what? I think, therefore I am chemistry? Biology? What is the evolution of consciousness? The brain is wider than the sky. For put them side by side, the one the other will include with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea. For hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb, as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God. For lift them pound for pound, and they will differ if they do, as syllable from sound. Emily Dickinson, depicting the brain. How did the brain evolve? How did consciousness evolve? Why this brain? What is perception? What is psychology but biology? How does government relate to sociobiology? E.O. Wilson, the father of sociobiology, an expert in ants, gives us insight into human nature. Is anyone an individual by choice? Is there such a thing as free will apart from biology? What does it mean to be a human? Ideas, like biological innovation, seem to follow the rules of evolution. This comes from Malin Hoagland's book on the way life works. From the random stream of thoughts, utterances, and writings, a few get selected and reproduced, while the rest are weeded out. An idea born in one brain evolves as it passes through other brains. Those ideas that spread best will find more enduring lives in the world libraries and CD collections. Any discrete, memorable idea enters the competition. Car headlights, microchips, Pinocchio, algebra, natural selection, and that TV jingle you hate but you just can't get it out of your head. The first order of business for an idea is to spread itself, whether or not it acts for the good of anything. The more it sticks in our collective minds, the more likely it is to survive. By almost any measure, the natural environment we live in is under stress. Many organisms have not been able to keep pace with the changes we have produced, and extinction rates are rising. Evolution suggests to us that ideas that work from one environment may not work for another. In other words, the ideas that got us here may not be the ones that keep us here. As some of our most successful ideas come to threaten the ecological balance of the natural world, we need to take another look at them and to make choices that contribute to the well-being of the life system as a whole. One such choice is what the biologist E.O. Wilson calls biophilia, which might be viewed as our natural sense of connectedness to life. Wilson writes, "To explore and to affiliate with life is a deep and complicated process in mental development, to an extent still undervalued in philosophy and religion. Our existence depends on this propensity. Our spirit is woven from it. Hope rises on its currents." It may be that our growing appreciation for that truth will be the greatest legacy we can pass on to our future generations. Thank you, Malin Hoagland. Thank you for your attention and your ideas. What is life? How do we work with life? Who are we now? What are the controversies and facts? What do we think about them? We now have the ability to genetically engineer humans. We may be the last of the native wild humans. What do we think about this? What will we become? Let's use the rest of this course to explore who we are and how we influence nature itself, and how this will deepen our appreciation for ourselves, our environment, and hopefully the sense of our future. Thank you.